Hi, Mr. Fernandez here to tell you a bit about Reconstruction, which some might call or have called America's unfinished revolution. There are the learning targets. And here's the outline of what this lecture is going to look like. I'm going to start by introducing you to the key debates around Reconstruction, after, of course, defining what Reconstruction is for you. Then I'm going to break it down into the two big eras of Reconstruction, presidential Reconstruction and congressional Reconstruction, tell you what those differences are. And then I'm going to tell you about the impeachment of the president at the time, Andrew Johnson. So Reconstruction. First things first, a basic definition of Reconstruction is that it is the 20 years or so after the Civil War, during which the United States became embroiled in the big debate over how to deal with the American South, which had seceded from the Union, had been defeated, where thousands and thousands and thousands of enslaved people were freed. What to do next was the big question during Reconstruction. One of the big things that had to be dealt with, of course, was the extent to which the Southern economy would be addressed and reintegrated back into the Union. The South was utterly devastated, and its economy was in tatters. So a big consideration for during Reconstruction was, what do we do about that? Another big question during Reconstruction was, what do we do about all the people who led the movement against the Union, who led the secession movement, who rebelled against the United States and the Constitution, who, in other words, were, for all intents and purposes, traitors? What do we do about those people? Similarly, a question became, what do we do about all the hundreds of thousands of people who weren't leaders but who followed them onto the battlefield and joined the Confederate Army and in other ways supported the rebel cause? The regular folks, what to do about them? What to do about enslaved people who were now freed, the hundreds of thousands of enslaved people who were liberated by the Civil War? And the last question that became a heated controversy during the Reconstruction was, who gets to decide the answers to those questions I presented to you a second ago. In other words, who is responsible for Reconstruction? Is it the President of the United States as the Commander-in-Chief of the Army and the Navy, or is it the members of Congress, the legislators in the federal government? Are they responsible for Reconstruction? Obviously, this is the first time this sort of thing ever happened, and so they had to answer this question with no precedents, really, to lean on. So, again, the big decisions for Reconstruction. Number one, should the federal government be lenient or punitive towards Southern whites? That includes leaders of the Confederacy, leaders of the rebellion, as well as those many hundreds of thousands who followed those leaders. Number two, who should be responsible, Congress or the President, for the process of Reconstruction? And finally, what do we do about all the enslaved people who are now freed, the so-called freedmen? Should their rights be promoted and protected by the federal government, or is the mere act of freeing them the extent of the federal government's obligation towards African Americans? Those big decisions had to be made during Reconstruction, and they were made kind of willy-nilly during the 20 years or so after the Civil War. In this lecture, you're going to find out about the early policies concerning Reconstruction, primarily in the 1860s. We're going to end in 1870. During class on Tuesday, you'll pick up the story with the 1870s and 1880s, and you'll learn more about what happened in Reconstruction and what became of Reconstruction. But for now, let's turn our attention to the 1860s. And in the 1860s, there was a heady moment during which Congress and the President began to deal with the issues of Reconstruction in a way that often brought them at odds. The 1860s period of Reconstruction can often be viewed as two periods, actually. First, presidential Reconstruction, that is, the, um, uh, the, the policies enacted by the two presidents during the time period. And the second period can be viewed as congressional Reconstruction, and that has to do with the policies enacted by Congress, who kind of took control of the process in the middle of the 1860s and had a very different approach to Reconstruction. Again, for every one of these, for both the president and Congress, these three questions were the ones that had to be answered. The point I'm trying to make is that they answered these questions differently. And let's explore what those answers were. Let's start with presidential Reconstruction, the 2.5 years or so during which Abraham Lincoln, before he was assassinated, and Andrew Johnson, his vice president, who then became president, took the oath of office and became president and led the process of Reconstruction. This is often called presidential Reconstruction. It can also be called moderate Reconstruction because it was kind of a middle-of-the-road approach to Reconstruction and to answering those three questions that I've shown you here a couple times. Let's start with President Abraham Lincoln's plan. Before the Civil War ended in 1863, Abraham Lincoln issued a proclamation of amnesty and Reconstruction. That was the title of his document, in which he laid out a plan for inviting the southern states back into the Union. The plan was involved two points. Number one, in any state that wanted to join the Union, the people in those states who pledged their loyalty to the Union would be pardoned. This pardon did not include Confederate leaders. They were not subject to this pardon. They would be punished. All the Southern whites had to do, however, to rejoin or to regain their citizenship rights would be to pledge an oath of loyalty to the Union. Once 10% of voters took that oath of loyalty, according to Lincoln's plan, in a state, that state could set up a new government and they could rejoin the Union. That's it. The one stipulation was that there would be no legal slavery when that state rejoined the Union. Slavery was to be banned by any state that wanted to rejoin the Union. In his second inaugural address, Lincoln won the presidency again in 1864 in the middle of the war, and he gave another inaugural address. And you can see sort of the theme of this approach to Reconstruction in some of the language of the speech, where he talks about reconciliation and forgiveness and moving forward. The plan is definitely a moderate plan. It's pretty lenient, right, when you think about it. Most white Southerners, all they had to do was to pledge their loyalty to the Union, and they'd be pardoned. They wouldn't be punished at all for their crimes, for their betrayal of the Union. And the state would rejoin with the Union when only 10% of voters took that oath of loyalty. That's it. It was a pretty lenient plan, and that was the kind of theme of his speech, where he says, "With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds." Let's get this over with. Let's move on. Let's put this behind us, is basically what Lincoln's message was to the country. At the same time, Lincoln, before he was assassinated, supported Congress's effort to place in the Constitution an amendment that would permanently ban slavery. And that became the 13th Amendment, proposed and adopted in 1865. But then Lincoln was assassinated in April of 1865, and Andrew Johnson became his vice president, became the president at this time. Now here's the deal with Andrew Johnson. He wasn't a true Republican. He was a moderate Democrat. The intention behind nominating him for the vice presidency was not really to make him president at any point, but rather to appease the moderates in the Republican Party and even get some Democrats to vote for Lincoln as well. So they picked a former slave owner, a former Democrat from Tennessee, to be the vice president, and now suddenly he's president. He was, of course, always loyal to the Union. He was the only senator from a Confederate state to remain loyal to the Union, and he was rewarded by being offered the vice presidency when Lincoln was running for office again. But again, it wasn't really about Andrew Johnson ever becoming president. He was too sympathetic to the South and too sympathetic to slavery for the Republicans to want to make him president. But then here he is. As president, he continues Lincoln's moderate policy toward Reconstruction. He pardons all the Southerners who pledged an oath of allegiance, just like Lincoln did, or at least he offers to pardon them. His plan, as part of his plan, Confederate leaders and the elite in the South economy would lose their right to vote. But unlike with Lincoln's plan, they could apply to the president to be pardoned. So even the leaders of the Confederacy could regain their right to vote, regain their right to be citizens, and apply for a pardon so that they wouldn't be punished if they did so directly to the president. And then finally, in any state that rebelled from the Union, once a majority of whites swore the oath, they could elect a new government. The stipulation, just like with Lincoln, was that they'd have to accept that slavery was no more, and they would have to vote to ratify the 13th Amendment. But once they did, they could rejoin the Union. Johnson was a white supremacist. Johnson was a pro-slavery. Johnson believed that white people alone must manage the South, as he put it, and it was, as he saw it, his role to be as lenient as possible towards the South, so that whites could regain their power in the governments of the southern states, and rejoin the Union as quickly as possible. So here's an image of President Johnson receiving members of the Confederacy who were leaders of the Confederacy to grant them an official pardon in the aftermath of his plan being published. Let's get back. So again, three big decisions. Should the federal government be lenient or punitive towards Southern whites? Well, Johnson and Abraham Lincoln's answer to that question was yes, they should. Should Congress or the President control the process of Reconstruction? The answer for Johnson and Lincoln, of course, was that the President should control the process of Reconstruction. And then finally, aside from freedom from enslavement, should African American rights be promoted and protected by the federal government? Well, you notice that neither Lincoln nor Johnson expressed any support for a policy of protecting the rights of African Americans. They, aside from, of course, ending slavery, they were not interested in doing anything more for blacks in the South who were now freed from slavery. Well, in 1865 or so, Reconstruction took a turn. And Congress began to push back against the president and to insist on having the bulk of the responsibility for passing laws or policies that governed Reconstruction. Specifically, it was the members of the radical Republicans in Congress, the members of the Republican Party who were the most far to the left as far as slavery and other issues, that took kind of the reins from the president and began to demand that Congress be given the central role in Reconstruction. Here you see three of these radical Republicans who were obviously very much anti-slavery, very much pro African American rights, and pro punishing the South. So why did this change? Why did Congress kind of begin to take control over the president, why was there more support for radical Reconstruction in the North after when Johnson was in after Abraham Lincoln's assassination and Johnson's rise to power? Well, one reason was that very quickly under President Johnson's plan, all 11 Confederate states rejoined the Union. And that seemed way too quick for a lot of people. Secondly, in the South, you started seeing the passage by state governments that were newly instituted or reconstituted, the passage of black codes in the South. Basically, these laws, called the Black Codes, which were passed in a number of different states in the South, made blacks second-class citizens, severely restricted the rights of freed slaves. For example, it made blacks, it prohibited them from renting or borrowing money to buy land. It forced African Americans into labor contracts as vagrants. If they were caught unemployed, they could be forced to take a job for a planter. It prohibited them from testifying in court against white people, and so on and so forth. All of this stuff suggested to many northern whites that the South had pretty much just returned to its old ways, with the rebels back in power and African Americans oppressed. And then the straw that broke the camel's back was the fact that very quickly under Johnson's plan, once states began to be readmitted into the Union in the South, they began electing former Confederate officials to Congress. People who had actively betrayed the Union were now elected to go sit in Congress, and for members of Congress that was too much. So the radical Republicans in Congress kind of fought back. They refused to admit any Southern state representatives to Congress in 1865. They simply forbade them from sitting in the seats that they had supposedly won in statewide elections in the South. They declared that only Congress has the authority to determine the conditions for allowing states to rejoin the Union, not the president, and that therefore Congress would have to be the one to pass policies that would decide when and under what conditions Southern whites would be allowed to rejoin the Union. So Congress began to pass a series of laws that implemented their vision for the future of the United States and the South. One of them was the Freedmen's Bureau Act. The Freedmen's Bureau Act created the Freedmen's Bureau, a federal agency that was responsible for assisting former slaves, primarily by helping with things like reunifying families that were separated as a result of slavery and the war, distributing food and clothing, establishing educational institutions around the South, job training, and things like that. The Freedmen's Bureau was seen as kind of a mediator between the freed slaves, as seen here in this image on the right, and the masses of white Southerners who were anxious to regain their status as superior to African Americans in the South, in the Southern society. As you can see here, the Freedmen's Bureau helped to increase the number of school-age African American children who were enrolled in schools between 1850 and 1880. The federal government provided money and the means to educate freed blacks, freed slaves, through the Freedmen's Bureau. Next up, the radical Republicans passed the so-called Civil Rights Act of 1866. Taking one step forward beyond merely helping African Americans get back on their feet, as the Freedmen's Bureau did, the Civil Rights Act guaranteed that blacks would have all the citizenship rights that any white citizen of the United States could enjoy. Blacks were declared citizens of the U.S. The federal government was given the power to intervene in state affairs in order to protect the rights of all of its citizens, especially, of course, African Americans. And this, of course, was a direct attack against the so-called black codes that had been passed in the South, negating many of those laws that had been passed by white government in the South. In order to solidify the Civil Rights Act of 1866, to make it more permanent, the radical Republicans in Congress also proposed the 14th Amendment in 1866. Remember that Congress can only propose an amendment. The states have to ratify the amendment. And that eventually did happen. But the 14th Amendment did a number of things to empower African Americans. Number one, it guaranteed that anybody who was born in the United States is automatically a citizen of the United States. That was not guaranteed before. That means that if you're an African American person and you've been born in the U.S., you were automatically a citizen of the U.S. Recall the Dred Scott decision, and recall how the Dred Scott decision in 1857 declared that blacks could never be citizens. This was a direct attack on the Dred Scott decision. It nullified it by making it part of the Constitution that anybody, including African Americans who was born in the U.S., is automatically a citizen of the U.S. and of the state in which they reside. According to the 14th Amendment, state governments were obligated to respect the rights of American citizens and provide, quote, equal protection of the laws to all citizens and so-called, and, quote, due process of law. So everyone had to be treated equally under the law according to the 14th Amendment. I mean, with some exceptions, as the Supreme Court will eventually interpret the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment also eradicates the 3/5 compromise clause in the Constitution, counting African Americans as one whole person for the purpose of the census. And finally, the 14th Amendment declares that any state that does not allow all adult male citizens to vote, who are otherwise eligible, they would lose representation in Congress. Moving on, feeling emboldened, not being feeling the momentum of their program as it's being implemented, the radical Republicans continued their the development of their policies by passing the Reconstruction Act of 1867. And this was basically a way to punish the South and make it very difficult for them to rejoin the Union after having rebelled against the Union. As per the Reconstruction Act of 1867, the South became divided up into military occupation zones. And every zone was controlled not by a civilian elected government, but rather by a U.S. Army commander. In those states, in those zones, only white men who had not rebelled could vote. That basically disqualified enormous percentages of white folks in the South from voting. Those people who could vote, and that of course included African Americans, now as a result of the 14th Amendment and the Civil Rights Act before that, those people who could vote would be asked to vote for delegates to a constitutional convention. The state would those delegates would write a constitution for that state that allowed blacks the right to vote, and then they could apply for to rejoin the Union, but only after also ratifying or officially voting to ratify the 14th Amendment as a state. So here is a map of all the military districts created by the by the Reconstruction Act of 1867. Each district was under the command of a general, and here's an image of all the generals who were who were in charge of ruling over these southern districts. And then finally, the radical Republicans in Congress also passed the 15th Amendment in 1868. And by passing, I mean they proposed it officially. Don't forget that Congress cannot make an amendment to the Constitution. Congress can only propose one, and then 2/3 or 3/4 of the states.
For what?
For an amendment, to ratify an amendment.
3/4.
Then 3/4 of the state, of all of the states, has to say yes to that amendment in order for it to be become part of the Constitution. The 15th Amendment goes one step further from the 14th Amendment by guaranteeing the right to vote to African Americans by saying that no state can deny anyone the right to vote, or the federal government for that matter, because of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. This was directly aimed at getting African Americans, guaranteeing them the right to vote in all elections, as long as they were born in this country and citizens of this country. So you can see here an image that kind of shows you a radical Reconstruction perspective. On the left-hand side, you see America, represented as Columbia, allowing the Confederate rebels to be pardoned, and then wondering, and she seems super dismayed about that, right? And then wondering whether or not an African-American soldier would also be kind of welcome into the fold of democracy. This was the radical Reconstruction vision. Why would we be lenient toward the rebels, the traitors, those who actively rebelled against the Union, and not protect those who were oppressed by and enslaved by those traitors, those rebels? Shouldn't we be placing them ahead of the free African Americans, freed slaves, against the ahead of the masses of white traitors in the South? As a result of all of these actions, including, of course, the 15th Amendment, black voting in the South skyrocketed. Freedmen is a word used back then to describe people who had been slaves and were now freed. And notice, and don't forget that white people who had fought in the Civil War in the South would not be allowed to vote for these few years. That meant that in many states, freedmen or blacks voted in larger numbers than even whites did. This was a time in the 1860s and 1870s of a flurry of citizenship and voting rights for African Americans that led to a huge amount of empowerment, at least politically, for blacks who had been slaves in these southern states as a result of radical Reconstruction policies. So, again, the big decisions. Should the federal government be lenient or punitive towards Southern whites? As you can see, the radical Republicans in Congress answered that the federal government should be punitive towards Southern whites. They should punish them severely. Should Congress or the president control the process of Reconstruction? Well, you can see that according to Congress, or the radical Republicans in Congress, the Congress should be calling the shots when it comes to Reconstruction. And finally, should African American rights be promoted and protected by the federal government? As you can see, the radical Republicans in Congress believe that yes, the federal government must do everything it can do, not just to end slavery, that's not enough, but also to actively promote the economic and political interests of African Americans in the South who were formerly enslaved and were now freed. Well, so that you can see then that there was this kind of transition from the president, Abraham Lincoln and Andrew Johnson, kind of being at the helm of Reconstruction, to Congress kind of taking control. And none of that transition did not come with a great deal of controversy and conflict. And I conclude this lecture by telling you a bit about how bad that conflict between the president and Congress became. So bad, in fact, that it led to the first impeachment crisis in American history. Andrew Johnson was no friend of the radical Republican in Congress. Remember that Andrew Johnson was A, white supremacist, B, a former Democrat, and C, a Southerner who had no interest in punishing the South beyond merely slapping their hands, no interest in empowering African Americans beyond ending slavery. As president, Andrew Johnson vetoed radical Republican bills over and over and over again. And those laws that you saw that were passed by the radical Republicans in the 1860s, most of those were passed as overrides of Johnson's vetoes. So radical Republicans had to muster up, therefore, enormous majorities, supermajorities in Congress in order to get anything done, because Andrew Johnson constantly vetoed all of the radical Republican agenda with his president's pen. And there is there you can see it, how just how many vetoes Johnson issued compared to past presidents. So all of this came to a head when the radical Republicans decided that they would find a way to remove Johnson from office. The way they did it was they passed a law called the Tenure of Office Act in 1867. And it said, the law did, and of course they had to override Johnson's veto. The law said that the president could not remove any executive branch official unless the Senate voted to allow him to do that. President Johnson challenges Congress to put their money where their mouth is by firing the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, without congressional approval. The House of Representatives, controlled by the radical Republicans, seize their moment, and they vote by a majority to impeach the president. That is, to bring a formal accusation of criminal wrongdoing against the president. That's what impeachment means, don't forget that. The next step in the impeachment, in the removal process, is the Senate would have to vote after a trial on whether or not Johnson was guilty of this offense. The Senate was not controlled or dominated by the radical Republicans the way the House was, and it voted in favor of impeachment or removal, but not enough to succeed. It needed 2/3 of the Senate to remove the president. So the president is impeached, but he's not found guilty of the crime of which he was accused, and therefore was not removed from office. Oops. No. Oh, you gotta be kidding me.